We going? Yeah, right on. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jan Kwak. I'm the Global Managing Director of Climate Change at Hatch. But more importantly, I'm just passionate about the mining industry. I really want the mining industry to be sustainable for forever, right? And how do you do that? And how do you keep this industry moving? This terrific panel, we're going to zoom out a little bit in this last session of the day. I've been paying attention to the different talks we've heard through the morning and the afternoon in this theater, and all kinds of interesting activity and interesting topics coming up. We're going to zoom out a little bit, and we're going to think a little bit more about the zero emissions economy, the zero emissions industry that we're looking for. Kind of look to the future a bit, and then come back to what are the practical, reasonable things that can be done incrementally, or large steps that could potentially bring us there. So hence the title there, Accelerating Australia's Transition to Low Emissions Economy. So maybe to kick us off, just a thought starter. Low emissions economy is there's a spectrum of topics in there. People talk about net zero, sustainable, low emissions. They talk about circular economy. I always find it a little bit imprecise, and what does that mean exactly? How is it organized? How does it actually work? Does the government lead that through policy? Do consumers lead it through their choices? Why would we switch to that? And even more, why do you accelerate towards that? There's not really a lot of discussion on that. So maybe as a little bit of a warm-up, just an experiment, we're going to ask the panel to introduce themselves one by one, a quick introduction, but then also, team, just a little bit of a snapshot of what your vision is for a low emissions economy. How would that work? What would it look like? What would be better? What would be different? I'm curious your thoughts. So we'll start with Tanya.
Perfect. Thanks, Will. I know we're the last session between the end of the day, so we'll do our best. I'm an associate director in ARENA's investment team. I look after heavy industry, spend a lot of my time thinking about green metals, mining, critical energy minerals. My much overused introduction line is to say that I'm a chemical engineer technically, but I wouldn't hire myself as a chemical engineer. In terms of a low emissions future, I mean, maybe I'll oversimplify it, but I'd say everything that can be electric is electrified, and all of those electric operations are, max energy efficiency, and all of those electricity molecules are low-cost renewable electricity.
Right on. Thank you, Tanya. Tim?
Thanks, Jan. Great to be here. So I'm Tim Dobson. I'm the Managing Director of Magnetite Mines. It's an ASX-listed company. We own 6.6 billion tonnes of magnetite ore in South Australia, which we're developing to a grade that will be acceptable for green iron and steel production. So that's who I am and what I'm doing with the company. My vision and view from an Australian lens is that Australia takes advantage of the net zero transition, and it uses its comparative advantages of large-scale magnetite resources, but more importantly, large-scale renewable energy resources, and we find the right way to replace fossil fuel exports, which will decline, with a way to export renewable energy. And that way we punch above our weight on the global stage in emissions, not only helping ourselves reduce our emissions, but helping our trading partners. So that's my vision.
Right on. Dane.
Thanks, Jan. So my name is Dane Noble. I look after industrial decarbonisation for AECOM across Australia and New Zealand, which really just means supporting our mining and heavy industry clients with their decarbonisation strategy and the execution of those strategies. So you probably stole my thunder a little bit, Tim. I was going to say something along similar lines. I think Australia's always been sort of coined the lucky country, and rightly or wrongly, I think it's probably our time now to really take advantage of the full potential that we have in front of us in terms of some of the best global wind and solar resources, the donor relationship between those, coming up the value chain. We've typically been known as just a bulk shipper of bulk commodities. So how do we add more value? And through green molecules, through where it makes sense, really growing into that green manufacturing, green metals, green industry, and really realising that full potential.
Yes, it's something that's happened in aluminum, right? We make aluminum where electricity is cheapest. And now we're seeing the same phenomena starting to happen in iron ore. We'll get onto that. Tijana.
Thank you. Hi, Tijana. I look after Fortescue's green metal projects. And I think I've been tasked with probably one of the most vital and challenging objectives in our industry. The question around what do I think a low emissions economy looks like, I think there's a lot of public rhetoric at the moment around having to sacrifice something for the good of the planet to get to this low emissions outcome. You know, we have to sacrifice luxury, consumer choice, growth. I don't think it has to be that way, and in fact I think we will only accelerate towards a low emissions economy if we recognise that it won't be that way, that there is actually more on the table, you know, better and different jobs, a reliable energy backbone for Australia, greater economic prosperity. And for China, I wanted to share one small anecdote. When you drive around Chinese steelmaking towns, you'll often see that they've painted the side of steelmaking infrastructure with blue skies and fluffy white clouds. And I just find it the most profound symbol of the people of China saying we want a better way. We actually want to find a clean way to still support this industry that is so critical to our economy. And so for me, the future looks like driving around those steelmaking towns and no longer seeing the painted blue skies and white clouds, but actually seeing blue skies and white clouds.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm David Cachot from Woodmac. I cover steel and raw materials. Obviously, in the last number of years now, we've been looking more at the demand shifts in terms of quality, the evolving landscape when it comes to iron grade and the origins of this iron ore, and we'll talk about it in more details. But for me, decarbonizing is around, you know, circular, so reusing, but valuing the resources that we've already mined, that we've already transformed, and maybe even changing our logic when it comes to designing equipment, you know, for the mining industry. Instead of changing entire truck, you know, there will be parts that will be standardized, which will need the cooperation of different truck manufacturers in order to facilitate that. But, you know, considering resources, waste, I mean, as resources, rather than just going straight to where it's coming from, the ground, but instead looking at what we've already mined in order to, you know, optimize that.
Thank you. We have the ingredients here for a terrific discussion. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so we kind of we thought we'd break the discussion into three segments. We'll start with a little bit about sectoral strategy, and then go into iron and steel, green steel in particular, and finish up with a bit of challenges and opportunities discussion. So to kick off, I'll just two sentences or a few sentences on the most recent report from the Climate Change Authority, which I'm sure many people have seen or in the news or what have you. It was published about a month ago, I believe, and in that one we set our national targets for Australia between 62 and 70% reduction on 2005, big number by 2035, so in 10 years. Just this morning, Chris Bowen was at a different conference commenting on that number. His view was that it was high enough to be significant and low enough to be achievable. He was afraid when Cabinet agreed on that number, they said if we go too low, it'll be evolutionary. People won't take it seriously, and if we put it too high, people will write it off because it's impossible. So the feeling was, at least at Cabinet, was that was a good middle ground to be ambitious, but not so much that it's unachievable. That was the only recommendation. The rest of it were roadmaps, and there were 5 key recommendations for Australian industry to adopt. Number 1 was around clean electricity. Number 2 was electrification. Number 3, clean fuel use. Number 4, accelerating new technologies, which is big. And number 5 is actually net carbon removal, so better carbon management so that carbon doesn't finish its life in the form of CO2 as much. So that's the highlights. Within the resources sector specifically, they called out electrification as the biggest deal of all, followed by alternative fuels, hydrogen or biofuels, and then also the need for carbon capture and storage in some way, especially in the hard-to-abate sectors. So starting with that bit, Dane, maybe we'll start with you. Carrots and sticks. So that's a nice vision for what it should look like. So getting there, you have a choice of, you have policy opportunities, right? You can create incentives or you can create disincentives to drive an economy. What's your view? What would create a meaningful change in in the mining and energy sectors?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. It's a good question. I think it's got to be the right balance, right? So if we look at the carrot side of things, if we just apply too much carrot, then what ends up happening is, we end up subsidising industries or facilities, and therefore those facilities otherwise wouldn't be economic, and that's just not sustainable for the long term, right? So too much carrot means we over-subsidise particular industries. On the flip side, on the stick side of things, we need our facilities and our industries to be competitive both globally and locally and domestically, and so if there's too much stick, then they're just not able to compete on the global scale, and it also they're then playing on an level playing field in the Australian context, because they're having to compete with potentially foreign importers that don't have the same level of regulation. So, and if we tie that back to, I guess, the Australian policy landscape, we talked about the safeguard mechanism. So, that policy currently covers any facilities across the country that emit over 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum. To put that into perspective, there was, in the last set of data, there was 233 different facilities covered by safeguard. Covers about 25% of our total emission profile, but of those 233 facilities, 87% of the emissions generated from them were from the resource sector, right? So the resource sector, you could say, carries an unfair share of the safeguard mechanism obligations. Not to say that, it's actually the reforms that happened last year now obligates those facilities to reduce their emissions year on year, but 4.9% declining baseline. And so you've got, I guess you could say, that's quite the stick, right? But on the flip side, you've got policy to support, the carrot side of things, and Tanya can talk a lot more about the ARENA funding, but whether it's Future Made in Australia, but even before that policy was enacted, there was the Powering the Regions Fund, 1.9 billion allocated. There's two different streams, one of which is Safeguard Transformation Stream, 600 million in funding to support those trade-exposed facilities, to help bring them up, to help make sure that they are taking action. So I guess to round out my point, you need to have the balance. I think you need to start with the carrot, make sure that you're enabling industry to take the right technology risks, help that technology mature in the Australian context, and then bring in the stick that helps those facilities, that penalises those facilities that aren't taking direct action, and really then just, I guess, empowering those that are.
It's always the middle ground, actually, isn't it? That's the most reasonable. So, you're right. So, but you mentioned technology in there, and Tanya, that brings me to your perspective. I'm really curious. You operate at ARENA, where you're kind of in the incentive side, like let's incentivize certain technologies. I'm curious, how are you feeling about how funding streams and innovation programs are helping get us there across these gaps? Are we seeing enough momentum, and how are you feeling about your ability to invest in the right kind of projects?
Well, I'm feeling good about the amount of money that we have to play with, so I think that's a positive. And actually, to that point, I actually look after the industrial transformation stream, so if you want to talk to me about decarb projects, I'm ready to listen. I think technology developments and innovation has always been critical to unlocking the next breakthrough or the next blue sky tech, and giving us future optionality. The thing is that exercise is always at cost. You're doing R&D or you're doing demonstration. Maybe you have some cash flow in that project, but usually it's not enough to be profitable, because otherwise, you get other funding or you can do it off your balance sheet. And so it's hard to get that type of work off the ground. And that's where funding streams like ARENA, or funding vehicles like ARENA, or innovation funds from big majors like BHP's got an innovation fund. All of those types of vehicles work really well to share the risk and share the cost of doing that early stage work, which is critical to unlock interesting, new, competitive, alternative technology. And it's also worth mentioning that you're trying to compete against incumbent tech, which has got a leg up, not only because of the experience curve and the economies of scale that technology has, but also because it's also been subsidized. Like in converting to renewables, we're competing against subsidized fossil fuel.
Yes.
So that playing field isn't even really fair, I might say. Although obviously we're on the incentive side of funding this kind of technology. I think in terms of momentum, particularly in this place, right? This is infrastructure. It's capital intensive. it's higher risk, it's long development timelines, like it's a tough gig, and the market moves relatively slowly. But I think there's been some interesting and exciting momentum. I know in my own portfolio, and we're going to talk about iron and steel in a minute, but we recently funded a pretty big demo scale project for Calix, looking at their Zesty technology, which is pretty exciting. The Neosmelt Consortium, BHP, BlueScope, Rio, a couple of others in the consortium there, looking at developing a pretty large-scale smelter, which is pretty interesting. And then there's a lot more earlier stage tech in our portfolio as well. Like we've got R&D projects looking at electrolysis and other kind of flow sheets. So I think there's exciting momentum. You just have to look at the investment profile a bit differently in this space as you would in a commercially viable project space.
Right on. Okay, now we've got two operating companies here, Magnetite Mines and Fortescue. Tijana, maybe I'll start with you, and then Tim, you second. I'm really curious. So we've got this sectoral policy now from the government. We've got emissions targets, and now here I am, a resource company, and I got to make sense of that. What's your reaction, Tijana?
Well, I think from a Fortescue perspective, we'd say 62 to 70% is a good step in the right direction. But if we're going to exploit the immense opportunity that we all talked about in our introduction, right, that Australia has this unique natural strategic advantage in renewable energy, then we would say the challenge for us to industry would be think of the 70% as a floor and not a cap of what our potential could be. Because really, yes, this is about doing what's good for the planet, but more than that, it's a strategic economic imperative for our country. And so welcome the targets. We think we can go further.
Tim, how do you feel?
I'll speak from a magnetite and a green irons perspective. So the policy signals we've had from both the state government in South Australia, where our project is, and the federal government have been really positive in the last 18 months to 2 years, particularly from the South Australian side. And I reflect back then in 2022 when I took over the reins at Magnetite Mines, green iron wasn't even a term, and now it's the headlines on the paper. And this is a very short period of time for what will be a massive new industry potential for the country. But we're in competition with other jurisdictions around the world, and I would make the comparison with Canada, that for a long period now has been putting a lot of money into the iron ore and steel industry. They put magnetite or high purity iron on their critical minerals list, and then 2 seconds later, Nippon Steel, Sojitz trading house from Japan are investing in a magnetite project. Vale from Brazil, biggest iron ore company in the world, investing in a magnetite project in Canada as well, so both in Canada. So that's where the rubber hits the road, and I think Australia's in competition with that, so we're getting the right signals, and those carrots are needed because this is a very infrastructure-rich proposition we're moving towards. Building a green iron industry has multiple components, they all have to come together at the same time, including starting by standing up magnetite, which is the raw material supply into green iron. So I think we've got the right signals, but at this point, magnetite in particular has not really got the rubber on the road in Australia yet.
Yeah, right on. So that brings us to the second segment of this, which is around green iron making, green steel making, and we've got a fair amount of expertise with us here on this topic. So we'll come back, Tanya, maybe to start with yourself. An iron ore-rich country. I'm really curious what yourself or Arena or your masters in the government feel about the scale of the opportunity for using our iron ore resources to get into green iron, steel making, et cetera. What could this look like? What's your view?
Yep. So it's the hot topic of the day, like you said. It's on the newspaper headlines, and it's getting a lot of attention for good reason, right? Like Dane, you mentioned Australia is a lucky country. We supply nearly 40% of global iron ore feedstocks in what is a very lucrative mining economy today. And hydrogen is probably your front-running use case, I would say, for what is the most mature green iron process flow sheet in HDRI. So there's a lot of good reason for it getting a lot of attention. I think you could probably think about the scale of the opportunity maybe on a spectrum of two edge case options. On the one side, we're essentially trying to preserve or secure our iron ore exports. And maybe David has some views on what that could look like and the risk that's associated there, but that's not a sure bet, I would say. But let's say that's the most conservative case, then at minimum you need to prove that Australian grade ores, magnetite already works, so that's a good thing, but hematite grade ores are technically and commercially viable in the future state iron and steel making flow sheets, which isn't so simple because we have some technical challenges that we need to overcome. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the green iron opportunity, which is what is being kind of showcased all over the news. And there's a range of ambition in that opportunity, depending on which report you read, and it kind of depends on the amount of Australia's iron ores that you consider upgrading to iron. But it could be anywhere from, let's say, $100 billion revenue opportunity to maybe $250 revenue opportunity. But it comes with a fundamental shift in supply chain, which means that this is a more complicated exercise than it's maybe being advertised as. And our customers who today buy iron ore, you're essentially pitching that you buy iron instead. And like Tim said, there's a lot of rival countries that are looking at doing this as well. And so I think there's a decent amount of timing that Australia has to consider if we're going to capture a portion or the whole of what's being advertised as a green iron opportunity. And that hedges on a lot of things coming together, lots of renewables, lots of cheap hydrogen at minimum. But I think there's an interesting and exciting revenue opportunity here for Australia. The margins of those plants look a bit different to the margins of iron making. So, I think this is an interesting time for the whole market.
Thanks for those comments. It's typical. Things that seem very easy at level 1, at the next level down, get very complicated very quickly. And in fact, a part of that, David, you're over at Wood Mac, and you guys publish a lot around the iron and ore.
And I agree. So
why do you comment?
I think Australia has been lucky, again, because China has not slowed down at the rate that many, us included, forecasted even a few years back. So Chinese crude steel production has peaked. We are at a plateauing stage, but how long will the plateau last? I think mining companies have been, again, lucky, and doing nothing has protected their balance sheets because, again, China is outperforming in terms of hot metal production. Therefore, iron ore demand, what we thought was going to be a downward trajectory, much sharper, much sooner than it's likely to happen. Having said that, China has not given up on their emission target reductions. They might be longer dated, but at one stage, China will accelerate, and the one that's going to be suffering the most on the iron ore front is going to be Australia. So we do see the overall seaborne requirement from China shrinking between now and 2050 by 40%, which means that pretty much Australia will lose 500 million tons of iron ore exports from China. This is very bad news. Also, when you consider that the quality that Australia produces, Fortescue produces, isn't going to be necessarily the one that all traditional customers will be looking to purchase in the future. So, having said that, again, we've been in Australia protected by a slower adoption of new technologies and relatively simple technologies such as EAF, which is electric arc furnaces. We've always thought, in mature economies, but also China, the adoption of EAF will be displacing hot metal at a much faster pace, which isn't just yet happening, but it will eventually happen. And we mentioned, magnetite operations having a role to play in protecting the market share of Australia. But, people tend to be addicted to high margins, and hematite, big operations from the majors are much more cost efficient and money generating than smaller magnetite operations. I see magnetite operations playing a role in a transition, the same way we're contemplating reducing iron using gas initially, switching to hydrogen. You could have magnetite operations in the mix for the next 10, 15, 20 years until green iron comes in force. Again, with Mackenzie, we might be considered a conservative, analysis firm, but we still see a future for green iron in Australia. We're forecasting about 20 million tons by 2050 of green iron, low-grade green iron produced in Australia. It's going to be challenging, but people are trying, people are putting money, where it should be put, and support of firms. So, yeah, that's it.
You've brought up a similar point that we've heard a couple of times already on the value chain rearranging itself a little bit in iron and steel. It comes down to the business case. It comes down to what does the new supply chains look like and what is the business case for it. So I'm really curious to come, maybe starting with you, Tijana. What is the business case for green steel? In Fortescue's hands, what is the business case? How do you make it make sense?
It's a really, it's a big question. So, I mean, long term, we know that green iron has to compete with grey. So this notion of a green premium maybe exists for the early tons, partnering with select early mover end users, but that's not going to last for long. And, all of the feedback we're getting from our steel mill customers in particular is you ultimately are going to have to produce a product that stands on its own 2 feet and is priced based on its value and use. If I then think about what is the business case for Fortescue for the Pilbara for Australia, I mean, I think it's been touched on that we see significant product placement risk for our ore, for Pilbara ores going into the future, and we're seeing an industry preference for higher grade ore bodies with Simandou and others coming online that are frankly not using our Pilbara based ore, and that presents a significant risk for us as a company, but also for Australia. There was a report published by the Chamber of Minerals and Energy last year, the Mandala report. If you haven't had a read, I suggest a quick Google. And I've got my book just to make sure I don't get the numbers wrong. But that report talks about the opportunity for West Australia alone to produce over 4.5 million tonnes of green iron by 2030. And that's $4 billion of export revenue growing to about 170 billion by 2050. But agree with Tanya, I mean, there's a wide range of data points. All of them, though, indicate a significant opportunity for Australia if we can get this right. But then I think the other thing that was touched on is, well, why would, for example, a nation like China allow us to do this? And why would they partner with us to outsource some of what is a critical industry for them today? We think there are 2 reasons. The first is it makes a lot of sense for China to accelerate their transition towards green steel. I talked before about the painted blue skies and white clouds, but to put some more hard facts on that, the pollution-related health issues in China cost up to 6.45% of their GDP each year. And between 2013 and 2023, they incurred between 800,000 and 1.2 million premature deaths per annum, resulting from pollution-related health issues. So there is absolutely a huge imperative in China to reduce particulate emissions even more than CO2. They're laser focused on reducing particulate emissions, so they see the opportunity in a green steel transition. What we have to nail as a nation, what we have to nail at Fortescue is, well, why would they then let us do some of that here? And ultimately it comes down to the energy arbitrage between their best renewables in Mongolia and our best, some of which is in the Pilbara. And when we look at it on a like-for-like basis and say, well, if you assume, and it is a big if, that you can get access to Chinese labour costs, Chinese technology, but using Pilbara solar, you're producing green iron at about $100 a tonne cheaper than China's best. Now, it is a big if, because it means that we have fundamentally reshaped the way that we partner with China. We've probably had some hard conversations around FIRB, and we've allowed them to share in that value chain, because short of that, they will find a way to claw back that $100 despite their renewable energy disadvantage with their labour cost advantage.
Right on. I heard 3 elements there: labour, technology, cheap electricity, cheap green electricity.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I will say that China's task is so immense that there is a need for them to subsidize or import, some of this low carbon material anyway. So if we are concerned about China doing it domestically, I think there's still, a name in the game for Australia to export some of this green iron to China. But there is also other parts of the world that will be interested in partnering with Australia, because it seems to be a one-way street, potentially between the Middle East, sending clean, nicer products to China, and Australia being left on the sideline.
So Tim, you're in a similar but different situation. I'm curious your view. You've also got it makes complete sense. Produce iron metal here where you can, it's cheaper here, and export it. How do you build the business case for magnetite mines?
So on the positive side, there's a win-win situation where if we make a green industry work here, it helps us decarbonise the world, so we get the moral credential of that, but we also make a lot of money out of it. We take advantage of this situation for the benefit of Australia's balance of trade, which is going to shift whether we like it or not. So we need to find new export commodities. The magnetite endowment that we have is quite phenomenal. In South Australia, 18 to 19 billion tonnes has been drilled out already, and there's a lot more to drill. As an example of that, we've drilled around 7 or 8 kilometres of our 110 kilometre strike length of our 2 tenement packages. We've got a third of that endowment just in 2 tenement packages, 6.6 billion tonnes. So once you get over the hurdle of the capital and the collaboration challenges that have to bring this together, to Tanya's point, then you've got an indefinite period of time, generations of prosperity ahead on the back of that. But the hurdle is right there in front of us now. How do we get the collaboration, and the carrots and the sticks are both needed to push us over that edge. You have to rise all of the boats at the same time with the stick, which is carbon tax and border adjustment mechanisms, whilst at the same time incentivising. And it's got to be at the far end, which is the market-facing mills. And this year, for example, Nippon Steel, the biggest steelmaker in Japan, and JFE, the second biggest, both had the Japanese government give them $1 billion Aussie dollars equivalent in yen to put in an EAF, finally get it and do it. They've been talking about it for years, and it forced them over the edge. They're both now building electric arc furnaces with the help of the government. And the government has a safeguard mechanism similar. They have a tax regime in Japan as well. So their blast furnaces are getting more expensive as they produce carbon-based steelmaking. So that's what we need to push the customer end. And then we need signals from the downstream market. You need customers to want to pay the green premium, to Tiana's point earlier as well. So all these things are needed at the same time to get us across this barrier, because the free market has already figured out how to make the cheapest steel in the world, and that's what we're doing now. But we've got a carbon problem. So how do we get across that? It's going to create collaboration, carrot and stick to get us over that hurdle, and then we're away.
Do you see it being possible without a green premium?
Without? Only through more subsidisation. So either the market's got to pay the green premium or the government does.
The government does, yeah.
And government procurement's going to have to pay
That's
a part.
the tricky bit. That's the tricky bit.
Yeah. Well, governments buy lots of steel, so they can lead the way, for example.
Yeah. True. Well, Tim, while you're talking, let's keep going. I have another question for you. Is partnering, the idea of partnering in the value chain between an iron ore producer and some intermediate company and a final steel producer, what are the opportunities to partner with your downstream customers? And Dane, I'll go to you as well. In either mature markets or in fast growth markets, right? Dave, you talked about China, and that's a mature market, so is Japan, but you got very fast growth markets like India and Indonesia happening now, where there's other opportunities in setting up a supply chain that doesn't exist.
So partnering with downstream motivated off-takers is absolutely essential for this, to build this industry that we're talking about, which starts with magnetite, moves to pellets, moves to DRI, HBI production for export. We can export all three of those products at once. But it's the downstream customers' balance sheets that will help support that, and the downstream customers' offtake agreements, long-term offtake agreements that take care of the marketing issue that you have. And that helps then make it investable for debt facility providers to provide debt funding to get it over the line. The good news is Australia has a long history of this. All of our big bulk commodity projects, whether it's LNG, coal, it's not a bulk commodity, but it's a big export commodity, then you've got coal and iron ores, are all mainly joint ventures with downstream motivated customers. We've got very strong partnering arrangements with all of the North Asian steelmaking countries, I should say, China, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and of course India is now much into the mix. The federal government's done a great job building a trade relationship there, and they're obviously a massively growing demography as well. So those relationships are absolutely fundamental for the success of this, because the shared financial and risk burden because it's so big, has to be shared a lot of players. Not one single entity can carry that risk.
Yes, I get it. Dane, continuing along that path, what are the key enablers for regional alignment or collaboration across that supply chain?
Yeah, look, I think you've got to tie it back to infrastructure, right? So, and that might be infrastructure that's privately led, but it also might need some, I guess, a bit of a step up from public support as well. So, And if we tie that back to the regions that historically have been our sort of industrial powerhouses, often they've been those regional communities, right? So what does the transition look for them? Making sure that we're considering social disadvantage, but also, looking at the skilled labour that is there and making sure that we're not losing that skilled labour. So, that's the role of organisations such as the Net Zero Economy Authority. They are there to support these communities transition in a just and equitable way, and that also includes bringing along not just remote communities, but First Nations communities as well, making sure that there's shared value, and it starts with things like access to clean, reliable and green electricity, firmed renewable electricity, access to ports, road, rail. All of those things are enablers, and where it makes sense for the public to step in and provide common user infrastructure to allow that industry to grow, that's a huge opportunity. And we look at those existing industrial powerhouses, how can they reimagine themselves? And Tim and I, from a South Australian perspective, but you've got a vertically integrated steel supply chain at Whyalla that goes from pit, magnetite to port with the steel product. Lots of discussion around a DRI pathway, whether that's natural gas, whether that's hydrogen. Is to be debated, but there's a natural gas supply chain there. There's a carbon capture storage facility up the road with Santos. All of the ingredients for a thriving green steel industry are already existing. So I think, how do we take advantage of that? How do we use the skilled labour that already exists to as we spoke about a number of times, to make sure that we're realising our comparative advantage?
Right on. Let's talk DRI actually, and that value chain. And Tijana, I'll come back to you. There's been changing trade patterns in how those iron units get into eventual structural steel and whatever, and there's been a rise of DRI as an intermediate product, not dissimilar to how MHP appeared in the nickel supply chain years ago, from nothing. Now DRI is an intermediate product. How can Australian resource companies position themselves in these new supply chains? What does it take to be competitive there? And also, what is the role of technology and OEMs in making that bit happen?
Yeah,
there's a lot in there, but let's have a shot at it.
We've alluded to this already in the discussion. With the exception of a few magnetite deposits in South Australia and in the Midwest of WA, the majority of Australia's ore is just not DRI grade, which means it's either the grade of Fe is too low, or there are too many impurities in that ore to go through your traditional DRI process, which is basically a high-grade pellet into a vertical shaft that then produces an iron that is high quality enough to go into a steel-making process. We have two issues using Pilbara hematite ores in that process. One, we can't make a competent pellet that goes into a shaft furnace. And two, we would be left with far too many impurities in that iron for it to then be efficient in a steel-making process. So for us to future-proof, the majority of Australia's iron ore supply, we need a technology that works for our ore. And for those of you who listened to my presentation earlier today, I spoke about the two-step process that we're building at Christmas Creek at the moment, which is probably the most common prevailing pathway accepted in the industry for using low to mid-grade ores to make green iron, which is hydrogen or natural gas reduction step. In our case, it will be entirely fed with green hydrogen and then coupled with an electric smelting furnace, which removes the rest of the impurities. So for us, it's critical to demonstrate that that technology works, that it's stable, that the product it produces is of value to our customers. And then the second part of that question is, well, how do you get that technology to compete? Because two steps are always more expensive than one, and you need more energy to turn a lower quality iron ore into a high quality green iron product. And so then it becomes an energy efficiency equation. We have to be able to produce green electrons at a really, really cheap price, and we need to be really good at producing hydrogen efficiently. And I spoke earlier in my speech about some of the key levers to do that, but it's improving solar panel efficiency, it's automating the install of those solar panels in the Pilbara to counteract labour cost, it's getting the cost of battery storage right down so we can firm that solar at a really, really cheap cost. And then it's finding a way to make hydrogen as cheap and simple as possible. We have over-engineered the production of hydrogen for metal making use. And once we crack those four things, and I'm Admittedly, it makes it sound very simple. Each of those are very big technical challenges in their own right. But once we've cracked those 4, then I think our 2-step process can start to compete.
Fascinating. Steel is cool again. For years it wasn't, but iron ore and steel is really cool again. It's fantastic. Okay, Tim, let's come back to your example of magnetite mines. You're at the very forefront of DR-grade magnetite development. Curious, what makes South Australia a compelling location for green iron production?
So South Australia's found itself endowed with a couple of major comparative advantages, which are not unique in the world. There are other jurisdictions that have these. Canada and Brazil come to mind. But the South Australian grid has gone from 1% renewable on grid to high 70s today, and will be at 100% on average by 2027. It's a relatively small grid, but it is a gigawatt scale grid, and that's one of the best outcomes for solar and wind and battery anywhere in the world. So that's one man-made advantage it's got. And the other one, of course, is the magnetite endowment, as I've already mentioned. There's 18 to 19 billion and a lot more to come. 100 years of high-scale volume supply, if necessary, to supply millions and billions of tonnes of iron units for the future. So it finds itself with these 2 comparative advantages. The third element right now is a government that's leaning right into it as well. So the South Australian government developed its green iron and steel strategy last year, ran a full expression of interest process, and had 53 submissions. We made a submission with our consortium partners into that. And Peter Malinauskas and his ministers are hell-bent on taking advantage of what he has in the state and leaving a legacy for that state, which has really been Sleepy Hollow economically for about 20 years. But he sees the opportunity, and I really love the vision of Peter Malinauskas. He wants to leave a legacy not to the next election cycle, but for the next 60 years for the state. And this is where we can take advantage of these comparative advantages.
Okay, so around 10 minutes left, and one last topic, challengers, enablers. Tijana, we'll come back to you. You said a couple of interesting things already. Maybe you can tie them together. How would you characterize the real challenges here? We got policy, infrastructure, finance, technology. Do any one of those stand out as the top one, or is it a blend of all of them? Tijana, what do you think?
It's all of them, for sure. I mean, and we've already touched on, I think, technology, infrastructure. But to round out on policy and funding, actually, when we think about an Australia-China supply chain in particular, we have to be really cognizant that, yes, we have to crack the economics, but there's also a huge geopolitical lens to this, which is you're asking China to basically allow some of the production of a very critical industry to take place elsewhere, and then to integrate into its value chain. And so policy dialogue that kicked off earlier this year on steel decarbonisation between our 2 countries, we see as a really critical step in the right direction to opening up that relationship. But the other key lever from a policy perspective is if you look at a cost stack for green iron, one of the biggest hurdles that we have is that we have to spend a lot of capital and we have to pay it back at reasonably high cost of debt. And so if we can get really cheap debt funding, we can bring the cost of green iron down significantly. It is actually the single biggest lever to reduce the cost of green iron. And then when you look at, well, who has deep capital markets and access to low cost of debt funding? China. And how can we leverage things like the sovereign green bond frameworks that are available in both China and Australia today to target these projects that are not just having domestic emission impacts but have a global emission impact? And is there some way where we can do that together, combined across the 2 nations? We think that's a significant lever. And then the final one that I think has been touched on a little bit today as well is demand side, levers. What could the government do around securing offtake, mandated government procurement, and especially for the early tonnes? So we're not saying this is, a crutch that we should have indefinitely, but in the early phases, is there an opportunity for government to secure offtake at a certain premium, claim the green certificates, for example, and hold those until a time when they can maybe trade them for a greater benefit in the future? Those types of support mechanisms would help get the industry started.
Absolutely. There's so many examples of that. It's the CAPEX hurdle. Often the long-term OPEX is okay. It's the CAPEX hurdle that kills. Tanya, I know you wanted to jump in on this one as well. What do you think?
I think that was covered really well. I think maybe just an interesting angle. I think it's all of those levers. They all got to come together, one big puzzle. To build let's call it a 1 million ton HDRI EAF plant, you're kind of looking at like 300 megawatts of electrolyzer capacity, which needs operating around the clock, which needs 1.5 gigawatts of firmed renewable energy capacity. And last year in Australia, we deployed 4 gigawatts of utility scale energy across the entire nation. China deployed 430 gigawatts of renewable energy. So I think we always talk about how Australia has access to really cheap renewables, and we do have potential access to really cheap renewables, but it's not actually there yet. And our development timelines, our approval timelines, all of those things really impact the project's economics, if you slow down by 2 years, 3 years, etc. And so I think one of the levers you can do today, there's no technology barrier, the commercials stack up if your timelines look good, is actually just getting the renewables out there.
Yeah, I think so. Another dimension to this that hasn't come up yet is climate disclosures. Dane, I know this is a part of the world that you operate in. Do they make a difference? Are they a part of accelerating?
Yeah, look, I definitely think they do. We've talked a bit about Safeguard. I think Safeguard gets a fair bit of airtime, but I guess the new policy that kind of, to me, has somewhat flown under the radar is the new TCFD standards, international standards that have been adopted by the Australian Accounting Standards Board, came into effect 1st of January this year, and sort of they stage in. And I guess for context, the first group, which was enacted the 1st of January, that's any corporations with, there's a couple of criteria. You have to meet, I think, over 500 million in revenue and 500 employees. Group 2 starts July 1st next year. That drops down to 200 million in revenue and 250 employees. And then Group 3 the year after, which is, I think it's 100 million in revenue, 50 employees, all the way around. But the obligations under under that new legislation is, as part of your financial reports, you need to disclose a number of things, including the climate risks to your business, the economic impact of those climate risks, and you need to model against various scenarios. At a minimum, there's 2, so 1.5, a Paris-aligned 2050 outcome, as well as a more than 2-degree 2050 outcome. And in order to do that, you need to understand your emission profile, right? And so this is now an obligation. Company directors are needing to sign off on this. They are liable. And so what that means is, we're talking, when we get to that third group, it's just about all of Australian private business and public business. And so understanding your emissions, reporting against them, and then having a climate transition action plan which puts action in place to reduce those emissions. I think the penny is going to drop for corporate Australia that when they look at all of their options, they're going to see that there are a large amount of technology solutions that are existing, that are mature, and when they put them on their marginal abatement cost curve, they see many of these projects are NPV positive. Why did I not implement these 5 years ago, 10 years ago? They make economic sense. Their IRR, their payback periods are 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. I think that, to me, is something that isn't discussed enough publicly around the impact that TCFD standard is going to have on corporate Australia and achieving our emission reduction plans.
Okay, just a couple of quicker questions left. Tijana, coming back on infrastructure that Dane brought up earlier, curious what you see as the biggest infrastructure hurdles.
Yeah, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll try and answer quickly. I mean, we plan to use a lot of our existing infrastructure in the Pilbara in terms of logistically moving both the inputs that we need for iron making, but also then moving the green iron out to ship to our customers. Some of the big enablers, though, that we do need is module offload facilities at the port, and the reason that that's a big enabler is because it allows us to effectively offshore a lot of the production of, for example, the green iron plant into very, very large modules, much bigger than anything we brought in for our Iron Bridge project, for example, and that reduces the capital cost significantly. So that's a big enabler for us. Desalination, I mean, water is a big constraint in the Pilbara, so desal is another big infrastructure investment. And then HV transmission, hydrogen pipelines, they are all very large components of the investment that we need to make for green iron to work, and they also have common user benefit. And so when we look at the areas where we'd love to see the government step in and provide support, it is in those areas that have a common use benefit to multiple players in the Pilbara.
Yeah. Okay, Tanya, one for you. A couple of times technology's come up. I'm curious what you see as technology gaps and what needs to be done there.
I think Tijana actually did a really good job of covering this, so I'll also be quick, nearly at the end. I think it depends. There's a few different process flow sheets that you can use in tackling green iron and steel, but there are some distinct gaps that we still need to prove out. You know, we're not using lower grade hematite ores in DRI pathways today, so testing that DRI ESF pathway at decent scale is something that needs to be firmed up. We're also not operating DRI using hydrogen as a reductant at any kind of massive scale. And it's not as simple as just switching out natural gas for hydrogen, even though that's how it's being advertised, because the thermodynamics of that reaction is fundamentally different. And so I think the largest scale HDRI facility that I'm aware of and happy to be proven wrong is the Hybus facility in China, and that's a 60% hydrogen blend. It's grey hydrogen, but that's a 60% blend. I don't think anybody is operating a higher scale facility or plant than that one.
We're building one.
Oh, sorry?
We're building one.
Well, when it's operating, yep, good bet. And that still needs to be proven out. It's not just a sure bet that you can do 100% HDRI and everything's going to work and you're going to get the right yield, metallization, product purity, etc. So, you know, those are in the more mature pathways. But then there's also work and opportunity in some of the more nascent technologies. I think in the news today, Electra announced the opening of their Colorado electrolysis plant, which is pretty exciting. So there's a lot of technology ground to break, but it's not so easy. This is not we're not starting from zero, but it's not completely mature.
We might just go to a wrap up, guys. There's some killer questions. We're not going to have time here, so let's go to a wrap up. This has been a really fantastic chance to hear from industry insiders from different parts of this story, and personally, I've learned a lot from you guys. Thank you for contributing your thoughts. I'd like to just go down, starting with Dave and coming this way. Just a quick one-sentence takeaway. What is your key message from today?
I think we talked about small companies and big companies like Fortescue, but I feel like the majors in Australia don't move fast enough. You know, they are being proven right, as I said, by the fact that China has been very resilient in terms of iron ore demand, but at one stage, the music's going to stop, and they would have not sufficiently invested, I feel. We mentioned Neo-Smelt. It's the right direction, but I think the scale of it and the sense of urgency should accelerate.
Interesting. Tijana?
Maybe my one reflection, I have this reflection every time I have to speak about green iron. I feel like there are the people who kind of get it, and there are probably a greater majority who think, but the economics don't stack up yet. And my response to that is, well, yeah, of course they don't. I mean, if they did, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. The industry would already exist, right? This is what every big industry transformation feels like before it's been cracked. The economics aren't fully there right now. So then you have to undertake the exercise of what do you need to believe to be true, and in each of those beliefs or assumptions, can you see a pathway? And I can, and that makes me really excited. I mean, I've put my career on the line working on this, and I think it's an incredibly exciting opportunity for our country.
Right on. I really appreciated the comments that we heard on business case and how do you build it. That's where it's at. Right on. Dane.
Yeah, look, I think the time is now, right? We're at a real injunction point, and we've got the opportunity. We need to take advantage of that opportunity. So,
absolutely. Right on. Tim.
I think reflecting both the comments ahead, and Tijana actually summarised it beautifully. My point: Australia faces it has a huge dependence on fossil fuels and low-grade iron ore exports, and it's made our standard of living and our economic resilience one of the best in the world. That is disappearing over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Our children and our grandchildren will suffer a major shift and balance in trade in this country as that happens, unless we do something about it. And thankfully, there is something we can do about it. We've been talking about it for the last hour, but it won't happen on its own. It's going to take a lot of collaborative effort and all of the levers we've talked about to come together. But it's incumbent on us as Australians to make sure that we set up this country's economy for the next generations to come.
Right on. Tanya?
I think maybe just an interesting comment on, maybe it's not call it the premium because that implies that the customer is going to take on, but the cost gap that we talk about, it's about 40% compared to incumbent technologies. Compared to other nascent industries, that's not bad. Low carbon liquid fuels, I think it's 200%. So that gap that we're trying to breach is actually relatively not that big when you compare it to other use cases. And I think maybe in the spirit of that, when you think about what E-curves can look like, you know, like think about the solar E-curve, 20% price reduction every time you double capacity. Like we've got a 40% gap today. As you start to install, that is going to get better. So maybe my cheesy parting line is, let's not just be the lucky country, let's be the strategic country.
Right on. Okay, great. Thank you. To the audience, thank you very much for listening right to the end. It's been a fascinating discussion. And if you can join me in thanking the panel as well.